which clerk will report by title.
A bill to support state and local accountability for public education, protect state and local authority, inform parents of the performance of their children's schools, and for other purposes.
When the Committee of the Whole House rose on Thursday, July 18, 2013, Amendment Number 21, printed in the House Report 113-158, offered by the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Brown, had been disposed of. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 22, printed in House Report 113-158. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have a amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 22, printed in House Report number 113-158, offered by Mr. Culberson of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 303, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Culberson, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment will restore state sovereignty over public education and restore parental rights over the education of their children by restoring the state legislature's power to accept or reject federal education grant dollars. I've worked closely with the committee to ensure that this amendment supports the goals of local control and flexibility as promoted by H.R. 5, and I sincerely appreciate Chairman Klein's support of this important amendment, as well as his continued leadership to improve our nation's education system. State legislatures, Mr. Chairman, should have the ability to make an informed decision regarding federal grant dollars, just as a patient consents to a medical procedure after a doctor explains the risks and benefits. I'm grateful for RSC 10th Amendment Task Force Chairman Rob Bishop's support and co-authorship of legislation we filed in this regard, and the support of the National Taxpayers Union and the Council for Citizens Against Government Waste, because my amendment will actually ensure that if state legislatures reject the grant dollars, they will be dedicated to reducing the deficit and paying off our outstanding national debt. Finally, it should be noted the Congressional Budget Office indicates that my amendment will have no impact on direct spending. I want to thank Chairman Klein again for his support and urge my colleagues to support both my amendment and the underlying bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas reserved. What purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts rise?
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I oppose this amendment because it endangers education funding for sort of a political exercise here. This amendment would actually require state legislators to approve every single grant program from the Department of Education before states receive the money. So taking the authority from the local communities, the local education agencies, putting it back into the state malaise of legislative process. It's overly burdensome on states, creates a mountain of unnecessary paperwork, and delays students and schools from receiving the much-needed funding. And when the short-sighted state legislators may refuse that funding, then the amendment would take the money and send it back, returning it to the deficit as opposed to its intended use, which is the education of disadvantaged students. I sometimes wonder if my colleagues remember why the federal government is involved in education K through 12 at all, and that is to address a shortage, a court-mandated addressing of shortage of attention to disadvantaged students. This is just another attempt by the majority to slash education funding. And Mr. Speaker, it's not the time to play politics now. Now is the time to increase our investment in education and in our children so that we can be competitive and so that they can have an opportunity moving forward. This amendment is simply a distraction to the very real, very big problems that this entire bill, H.R. 5, has, and it lets students down. H.R. 5 guts education funding because it locks in that automatic cut of sequestration. It does nothing to ensure students improve learning. It does nothing to make sure that they graduate from school. It lets students with disabilities be taught to a different, lower standard. And H.R. 5 blocks grant funds and forces states to give the money to private schools and for-profit companies instead of students. For these reasons, Mr. Chairman, I urge that the colleagues vote no on this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd point out that the amendment, in fact, upholds our system of dual sovereignty and ensures local control over local dollars, and the legislatures will actually be able to conduct this vote as a part of their regular legislative proceedings during their annual budget vote. The amendment, as it says in the language itself, the vote will be taken by the state legislatures as a part of their budget vote. This is a vote they take as a part of their regular legislative session, so it's no additional burden on the states. We're simply ensuring transparency and ensuring that the legislatures fully understand the implications of accepting the federal dollars. And those dollars that, for example, Texas rejects, we want to make sure go toward deficit reduction and paying down the national debt. So it will be no additional burden on the states. And in fact, this amendment will, in fact, reaffirm and restore our Constitution system of dual sovereignty, where the states retain a residuary and inviolable sovereignty over those issues that deal exclusively with the citizens of their own state. And I want to thank Chairman Klein again for his support and urge the members to adopt this amendment and the underlying bill.
Gentleman reserved.
And I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thanks, Chairman. Look, I just want to give a little historical perspective to this again. You know, the whole reason that the federal government's involved in K-12 education is because states weren't doing the job when it came to addressing disadvantaged students. There was a judicial mandate that said that states had to step up and do that. The states, were then problem by the fact how much that was going to cost. So the federal government stood forward and said, you can have some federal monies if you do the job. And so we've had that tension between flexibility of how they'll do the job and how we will hold them accountable for years. But this notion of saying that the state government will now decide whether or not local communities will accept the grant, and if they don't, we're not going to apply that money to actually educating those children that are disadvantaged. We're going to toss it back into the Treasury is no other than a way of cutting education funding. We don't need education cuts at this point in time. We need an investment in education. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserved. Gentleman from Texas.
Actually, the money will continue to flow to the states as it does today. The state law already sets up a mechanism for the money to flow through the states to local school districts, so that money will continue to flow. And also, under the language of my amendment, the federal government has an unshakable obligation to ensure equal protection and due process. So that 14th Amendment obligation on the federal government is undiminished and is expressly reaffirmed in my amendment. So there will be no discrimination nor imposition on every American's right to equal protection and due process. And I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
No. Well, I don't want to beat a dead horse here. Simply the notion is that states that were already at fault for not having done the job now get to not do the job again as long as the state legislators are the one that make the decision. That goes through your language doesn't make it quite as simple as to how they'll vote in the state legislature. It will be a delay if it's done at all. And if a state should make the unwise decision, as they had done historically, which gave the reason for us being involved at all in the first place at the federal level, then you're cutting education money. You're not applying it to the use of educating disadvantaged students. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserved. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I urge the House to adopt the amendment and support Chairman Klein's underlying bill and move passage.
Do you reserve?
And I'll reserve if the gentleman has no further comments. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Request for recorded vote.
Gentleman requests. Pursuant to Clause 6, Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from